Welcome everyone. I'm excited to be presenting to other people in the fractional community because often I'm talking to practitioners and product owners and so on. So lovely to see you all here. I'm Rahel Bailey, and I am a fractional content officer, chief content officer, or they're usually not called chief content officers, they're called something else, but basically that's what I do, is I work in content. So I'm talking about streamlining content for content production for success. And today we're going to look at the principles behind content operations. We're going to look at the benefits to adopting an operating model for content, and then some key aspects of delivering content to multiple outputs so that you kind of get what this whole content operations thing is about. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples. So the first thing we're going to look at is a framework for content. So what is content? So I say content is potential information. And if you're familiar at all with that whole knowledge management or knowledge pyramid, we have usually it goes data, information, knowledge, and they always leave out content. And content is really important there because content has more nuance than data, though it does need more context to actually become information. So if you think about it this way, I can give you the number 12, it's a piece of data, and you know that it's smaller than 13 and it's larger than 11, but that's about all you know. And if I said, is that good or bad, you would have no context. So as soon as you add some context, like 12 equals a month, you can go, it's the 12th month of the year, so it's December. And so now I have a piece of content, but it's still, I've got enough context to place it in the world, but I don't have enough context to tell me whether it's good or bad or it's important. So if I then said, okay, well, what does December mean? It's time off work. It's I get holidays, and so I can celebrate Christmas with my family. I can have New Year's Eve off, those kinds of things. So now you've got enough context for it to be information. And then if you wanted to bump it up into knowledge, I think that's actually very contextual. So if you would say, what's knowledge given 12 equals December, and knowing that I get time off, I might go, oh, my knowledge is that I can go on a vacation. But if I want to go on a vacation, I better book early because it's going to get crowded and things I want to do might be sold out. Whereas someone in, for example, in Thailand, they might say, 12th month means December. It means Independence Day. But what my knowledge is that we're going to be invaded with tourists, so we have to prepare for the tourists coming. So, the knowledge is very situational. So if I were to say, like, what is content? I would say it's human usable contextualized data. And human usable, because if you have one of those URLs that's just kind of after the question mark is this long string of numbers, it's not human usable. It's machine readable, but not human usable. So it's still data. But as soon as you say, we're going to replace that string with something that's, a canonical rewrite. So it's not a string of numbers, it's the name of a product that I would recognize and can absorb as a human. Now it's content. And then that it expands from there. Now, I've seen people say things like, the content doesn't matter, it's the design people come for. Well, if I were to take a web page, and I have one here, and I hid all the content. So now what do you have? You have some things that's very functional, but without content, it means nothing to the users. So when people are developing a digital product, they have the code, very useful, but it's like doing the treasure hunt. It's not the treasure itself. So content is that payload that goes inside the vehicle that's doing the transportation. So code does the transportation, it moves things around, and the design makes it obvious what's being moved around to where. But without the content, you have no way of interacting. It doesn't mean anything to the user. So here's all the visual content. And that's great because now you know it's a page with Barry Cranford on it, and you can see that there is a stock photo actually, but there's a photo of books, and you see that there's a button here, but it doesn't even tell you what's inside the button. Do I need to click there or not? I know we're talking about LinkedIn and we've got some icons, but that's it. So how am I going to interact with it? Probably not very well. But if I expose all the content, now we have a complete picture, right? So we know what I can do. I can complete my task, which would be to either click this link or to click that link, or whatever I need to do. I now know how to do it. So if I want to put together a content strategy to make sure that this content is delivered and delivered well, let's just get some definitions out of the way. So a content strategy, a strategy basically means a plan. So it means a plan for content. So the plan is to create some sort of repeatable system that governs the management of style throughout its life cycle. And I can go through each one of these, but it's you're all smart people, so I'm going to assume that a lot of this stuff makes sense to you. What I want to do, though, is talk about the content life cycle, because there is this idea that content can be a supply chain, and very rarely is it actually a supply chain. So here we go to talk about the difference between a supply chain and a life cycle. So using an analog metaphor, if you have Deliveroo or DoorDash, depending on which country you live in, you have a preparation of food, then there's a transaction that happens, and then there's the delivery. And once you get that content, which is the food, you're done. And that's the supply chain. Now, if you were to take that supply chain and turn it into a life cycle, it would mean that someone would come and pick up the dirty dishes, and the driver would then take it back. You would get a refund for whatever dish deposit, and then those dishes would be prepped for the next iteration, and then you would go. And when you think about content, it works more like a life cycle than it does a supply chain. So this is what a typical life cycle looks like. You do your planning and your analysis, kind of what you're going to cook, if you will, and then where you're going to get it from. Are you going to write it? Are you going to get it from somewhere else? Are you going to translate it? Do you need metadata on it? And then there's the whole idea of how do we manage it, the modeling, and what kind of a database you're building, and the repository, which standards are using, and so on. And then there's the whole thing about delivering the content. So do we deliver it to a website? Do we deliver it to multiple endpoints, like a wearable, mobile, etc., kiosks? It could be anywhere. And then how do we measure the content to see how it's performing? And then do we decide that it needs improvement, in which case we iterate and we go back up to here? So it's content. When I think about content in a life cycle, I think about a slinky. So those toys, a slinky, where it kind of goes around and around and around. So, and it's really important that you get a solid foundation, because once you start going around the life cycle, and not so much for marketing content, I don't think, but for product content, when you have a digital product, you can have 10, 20, 30, 40 iterations of it before, you think about an iPhone that, it's on version 14, something like that. Some of that content may have existed with version 1, and it's gone through 14 iterations for each country that it's in. So when you think about that, you really need a good operating model so that you can make sure it's like smooth delivery of the content into the product. And when I say the strategy, this is actually the quadrant that the strategy lives in. The rest of it is the implementation of the strategy. So when I think of a strategy, we say, okay, this is the what, the plan to create some sort of system for managing it. And then this is the why, is because we're trying to meet a business need or solve a business problem. That sounds a lot like management consulting. And in a sense, a good content strategist is like a management consultant. They just use very content specific questions, and they solve for content specific problems. And then after the what and the why, this becomes the how. So from an organizational point of view, when you think about content, you're thinking about some sort of an asset. It's an organizational asset. Organizations want to get the most that they can out of their assets. So they don't want to just like use once and toss the way you would do with a tissue, a disposable tissue. You want to treat content like, content is expensive to produce. And so you want to get more out of your assets. And so just like having a linen handkerchief instead of a tissue, you want to be able to, wash it and iron it and use it again. So the same thing with your content. You want to be able to reuse it however many times you can. If you want to realize its full potential, it has to be managed well. So if you think about accounting systems and how they used to be in books with T ledgers, and you had to make entries in 4 or 5 places, and then at the end of every month, everyone would bring all of their books to the head accountant, who would spend a week, tearing their hair and trying to reconcile everything. And now you have a system where you just put content in, or you put data in, actually. You put in data, it calculates things, and you can click a button and see a dashboard, and that's the current financial position. And so you want to be able to do that same idea with content, in that you're not doing a lot of manual steps and repeating things and so on and making it laborious. You want to put content in, automate certain things, and be able to have this streamlined production cycle. And so here's the how of content operations, because all of these things, the first 3 items are more on the ROI side. We want to increase revenue and expand into new markets and build brand trust. But then how do you do that? Well, you have to operate with more efficiency, and you can reduce your production cycle so that you reduce time to market, and you can manage your risk better. And that's especially true in regulated industries. So what is content operations? So we're talking about the how now. So if I'm going to frame content operations, I would say it's a way of leveraging content as a business asset. And to do that, you have to have a set of principles, because it's very situational. So it's not connected to a particular method or a particular technology, even within one company, because you have many genres of content. Therefore, you have many content life cycles and different rhythms of production. And is not connected to a particular technology for the same reason. So the set of principles is used to optimize your content production. And you can do it through people, through processes, and through technology. And usually it's a combination of all of those. And what we're doing is leveraging content as a business asset. And why? Because we're trying to meet some business objective that is related to content. So if I look at improved operations and how we get there, why do we want improved operations? Because we want to scale, for example, and that's a big one. People will say we want exponential growth in that terms of the EXO organization, exponential growth for organization. Everyone wants to be the next Uber, Airbnb, or Spotify. And so to enable the scale with content, you need to really operate with efficiency and in a very specific way. You want to be able to monitor and analyze your content, and you want to be able to respond to demand, because when you get more demand for content with maybe a new product line, or there's a new regulation that comes out, or you've got new requirements, you want to be able to respond to that and not have to do kind of like surge pricing and surge staffing. And I see this in government a lot. So I worked with a department during Brexit where we had to there's a requirement that, within 48 hours, you have to publish things on the government website. And somebody would stand up in Parliament and make a pronouncement. And then within 48 hours, we had to research, write, get signed off, and put stuff on the website. And you never knew what they were going to stand up and say. So that whole thing of speed meant that they had to bring in, and they would spend like £1 million bringing in 20, 30 extra people to handle that workload. And you'd think, well, if we did it really efficiently, we wouldn't have to bring in those 20 people, train them up, get them all on board and familiar with the content, with the topics, and then let them go again and then bring them in, and it's kind of an annual thing. So those things on the right, the single source of truth, standardizing, and that's like a single repository for your content, standardizing your processes, having some sort of continuous improvement cycle, managing your risk, reducing efficiencies, and automating your own tasks. They may seem really basic, but you'd be surprised at how many companies, and I would say upwards of 90% of companies don't operate with the efficiency that they could. And there are many reasons for that. We'll talk about a few of them, but it's a really quite shocking out there how what a dearth of knowledge there is about content processes. So ideally, you want to have this state. Now, a boarding pass has mostly data on it, but it really does kind of tell you what your ideal state would be, where you have one source. There's a database, and it has, actually there are probably many databases, but content is stored in one or more databases, and it's pulled out as you need it. So depending on whether you go to the desk or you go to the kiosk or you show it on your mobile phone, you're going to get something that looks very different, but it has all the information that you need. It might be in different places, but it's all in where you need it. And it works with data. It's a little bit harder with content, because content has things that data doesn't. It has grammatical rules. It has nuance. You take 3 pieces of data and put them together, and you have 3 pieces of data, and you put 3 sentences together, for example, and you could have something that is really ideal or very inflammatory. So as soon as you do multi-channel delivery of content, it adds a significant layer of complexity as well, because of all sorts of factors that content people can tell you. And especially they will tell you when you're making decisions that they think are risky. So the typical production model for content is actually quite basic. And it starts with this hodgepodge of tools that are actually meant for casual business use, like word processing. That's meant for a letter to your boss, or HR sending some letters out to staff, or putting together a proposal for a client. It's not really meant for production. And so when you look at these tools, you say, okay, well, we need you to do this and this and this, and you right away the writers will tell you, well, a word processor doesn't do that. And so now you are automatically kind of hampering the process, and you do it at every stage, because you'll have things by email, by word processor. You'll have a PDF guide, which means people are always going and looking things up, or maybe assuming that they know, and then they don't look it up, and then they make a mistake. You store it somewhere else, then you do approvals through other channels, and then you do finalization. And then there's this copy and paste into the CMS. And if you were to ask the average manager outside of content what the content processes is, they would say there are 3 steps. You write, you copy and paste into the CMS, and you publish. And it's really, that's the last mile. That's focusing on the last mile. And so it really doesn't work for the content people. And it's always the content people who end up having to bear the brunt of the decisions of the technologists, which is so dysfunctional, but exists everywhere. So the upstream blockers never get addressed, and they don't get addressed because of a lack of understanding of the process, or the lack of knowledge with those with the responsibility to take care of those processes. So somebody will say, well, your marketing manager or your CMO should take care of it. The marketing manager doesn't know about content technologies outside. Maybe they know the marketing tech stack, but they don't know anything else about the technology. They know about marketing. They're not a technologist. And the technologists who are in a position to make improvements, they don't know about content processes. So they try to treat content like code, and it works to a point, and then it breaks down and it fails badly. And I've seen it in so many situations where, you know, I've been called in and it's a mess, and then you have to clean it up. And they will say things like, I've been doing this for 15 years and I've never heard of these things that you're proposing. And you think, well, how could that actually be? But because of that, they tend to be gatekeepers as opposed to enablers. So that's something to think about. So the problem with focusing on the last mile is that there's this assumption that, and using the same example, that if you give the rider a better helmet or a better GPS or a faster motorcycle, you'll get your food faster. But actually, that's not quite the case, because if the kitchen's a mess, oh, and I want to say that this is, you know, there are these 3 stages. There's the preparation of the raw materials, so that's kind of like the cooking, and then there's the handover, and then there's the last mile. And they concentrate on the last mile. But if this kitchen is chaotic, then you're never going to get your food faster, no matter how well you equip that last mile. So who's cleaning up the kitchen? In other words, so who's taking care of the actual authoring and the tagging and all of those things that, you know, the writers should be doing as they're preparing content? So expecting that the tech is going to make all of the magic happen, it's kind of unrealistic, because you're asking the technologists to be mind readers. And, you know, they're, even if they could, they're too busy to be mind readers. So there's a certain amount that needs to get distributed, of the responsibility to get distributed upstream. And those upstream processes, when they are optimized, it really makes things easier at the last mile. So there's a lot of hidden costs of inefficiencies. So as I mentioned, at the authoring stage, there are manual steps that aren't looked at. And I have seen where we could get 80% improvement. And when you tell somebody we got 80% improvement, they'll say, no, that's impossible. You're lying. Which is, you know, the flip side. You can show them this, how much money they've been wasting. And the first response is denial. And you have to actually kind of break it down. But there's a lot of efficiency that can happen by cleaning up the processes at the authoring stage. And the dirty little secret within content is that the big cost is at the maintenance stage. And if you think about it this way, and let's go back to that boarding pass, if you had to update each one of those 5 separately, and then you had to make those updates separately, not only on 5 different versions, but for every passenger on that plane, it would take an army of people just for one plane to keep everything in track. And you have the same thing with content, in, you know, slightly different situation, but it's you have a piece of content and it goes into 4 product lines, and maybe there are 4 products in each product line. That's 16 copies. And now you take that and you say, oh, we have 26 countries of the EU, and now we have those replicated for all 26 copies. And now you have a change. There's a product name change, or there's a specification change, or something has to be rewritten. And now how many copies do you have to update? And this is where they bring in a bunch of people, or they outsource it to a country somewhere across the world and say, please update all of our content. And it doesn't have to be that way, but that's where you get a lot of your costs. And what you want to do is have the boarding pass model, where you have a piece of content, and you fix that piece of content, and then you say generate, and it transforms the content 26 times, or 26 times 16 times from one single source. And that way you are doing it from that single source of truth. You know that it's updated because, you know, all the processes are quite solid. The other piece we talked about was the casual business systems for actual production grade processes. And this other one of ignoring the cost of low value tasks. So every time someone has to search for something, they can't tell what the latest version is, or they don't know which database it's in, or they are fixing typos. You can use AI to help with that content optimization. And there have been tools out there for 20 years that people could use, but for some reason they don't understand that the having two editors would pay for, you know, one license of, you know, the tool, and you would get all of that done in a record amount of time. So there's that kind of, you know, using AI as an assistant, as a content assistant. And the last one, the second to last one about needing manual effort, that's a big one, is you want to be able to auto-publish to multiple channels without any manual intervention. You don't want any copying and pasting. You want to just be able to kind of hit generate, and it will go into your CMS, and it will go into your app, and it will go into wherever it needs to be, or to your sister company who also uses that content for something. And the last but not least, which has nothing to do with technology, it's about executive management. Executive management will say that content is king, but they don't treat content as king. They don't look at content. They're not interested in content. As soon as you talk about content, their eyes go blank and they say things like, well, how often do you need to blog anyways? And you think, have you not listened to a thing I've been saying? So really, you know, executive management needs to kind of not be ostriches when it comes to content, and say, well, you know, I think that it's an important thing for our business. You know, this is how we communicate with our customers, and let's give it the operational attention that it needs. So how does this work? I've picked a sample topic that will show you kind of the traditional way that things work, and then the an improved way that things work. And if we were all in the same room, I would have you do an exercise. I just did this last night with a group of students at a university in the United States, and we actually timed it, how long it took to do in the traditional way, and then how long it would take in a more efficient operating model. So this is a sample topic, and it's written for the UK, and it's about handling respiratory infections. And you can see that there are a whole bunch of UK specific terms. You go to a surgery in United States and Canada, it's not called a surgery. Surgery is actually cutting somebody open and, you know, performing the surgery. It's not a place that you go to. A GP is very UK specific. A chemist is like a pharmacist elsewhere. Paracetamol is a UK version for acetaminophen. And, you know, because we do things in metric mostly, that changes every day, but in the UK, we would say, you know, take a dose of 5 mil. Now, here are the content variants for three different countries, UK, US, and Canada. And this is all in English. So this isn't even with translation yet, but it is a form of localization, because if I were to say paracetamol in Canada, nobody would know what I was talking about. So you'd say, okay, there are certain things that we have to change. So here's how you would normally change it. You would have, you'd print out 3 different files, or you would bring 3 different files up on your screen, and then you would make sure that each one of these gets changed. So you'd say, okay, surgery has to become clinic, here has to become doctor's office, GP has to become primary care physician, family doctor, and you would just go and make, you know, you could either update one completely and then the other one and the other one, or you would bounce back and forth between the files. Now, when we did this for this one topic, manually, where they already had it printed out and they just updated it, it took 4 minutes. So 4 minutes, everyone was done in the class. It was a small class, about 12 people. Now, there's another way to do it. And that is to give people an editor, give authors an editor where they can have all of your variables in little lists. I'm going to call them little lists. We call them content references. You could call them reference data sets, I suppose. So you say, okay, the location, the name of the location varies. So in UK, you call it a surgery. The US, you call it a clinic. In Canada, you call it an office. So we're just going to say locations. And when we generate the UK version, it will substitute the word surgery. When we do the US variant, it will substitute clinic. And when we generate the Canadian version, it will substitute office. And same thing with doctor types. We've got these doctor types. Even what we call them, a consultant, you don't call anyone a consultant who's a doctor or a senior doctor. And in North America, having the title doctor is very important, whereas here it switches over to Mr. And it took me a long time to figure that one out. So we know that all of these that are in yellow are something that needs to differ from output to output. Now, additionally, in the UK, you can go to the chemist or the pharmacy or the drugstore, and the pharmacist will may be able to prescribe something for you because they are able to prescribe certain things. Whereas in North America, no. So you can say this entire sentence is for the UK only, whereas these two sentences, this sentence is for these two countries only. So now this first sentence or this first paragraph has no tag on it, so it would be for everyone. Whereas this one is only going to show up in the UK site, and this one will only show up in the US and Canada site. And same thing for this last bit. You would say teaspoon is for US and milliliters is for Canada and the UK. And so when you are doing those variants, those will automatically happen. So you take more time to set it up once. And then when you're done, you hit generate or submit or okay or whatever your software says, and you get 3 versions. And you can see that we have surgery, clinic, doctor's office. Here it says if the GP sends you to the chemist, whereas here it says if the primary care physician doesn't give you a prescription, ask for this at the pharmacy or at the drugstore. And here it says family doctor, you ask for a set of at the pharmacy. So you can see that these would come out the way they're supposed to come out. This is 5 milliliters, 1 teaspoon, 5 milliliters. So you can see that and this one took students just over a minute and a half. So it's about a 60% decrease in effort. And if you take this times multiple times a day, times multiple outputs, times multiple variants, you can see how much time you could save. And I can tell you that I did some work with a credit card company where we were talking about the credit card machines. And so we were trying to align all of the terminology over 3 writers. We had four types of credit card machines in 3 different there were 4 different transaction types across 3 different machines. So it was 12 variants. And at some point I had all 12 of these things. They were pages and pages long, all printed out, and going across all of them and finding mistake after mistake after mistake after mistake. So it was not only taking up the writer's time, it was taking up my time as the strategist to be the managing editor. And if we had been able to use this method, we wouldn't have had any of that. We could have had 1 writer and they could have done it all. And they could have done it all in record time. So if we want to build in efficiency, we have to look at the entire ecosystem. And so we're not just looking at the CMS. what we're looking at is a production environment. So this is where the authoring gets done. Or if you're doing visual content, you probably are ahead of the game. But let's start with the content. We have the production environment, some sort of an orchestration environment, and then a delivery environment. And so what you have, and I'm going to start with photographers because this will kind of drive home the point. You don't ask a photographer to work in your CMS. They take the photos and they put them into Creative Cloud or Premiere Pro or something like that. Or an illustrator might use Illustrator or Creative Cloud. And they do all of their specialty editing there. Then there's an orchestration environment. So it's like, what do I output to? Do I output to JPEG, to PNG, to, what is my output, one or many? And so I do that all in here. So that's the processing environment, and you might not even see it. For you, it might be one of those like save as buttons, and there's some magic that happens in the back, and then you have it. And then where do you put it? So they would put it into an asset management system, because here you might have photos and text and all sorts of little fiddly bits. By the time it hits here, it's an image. It's ready to publish. And so you've got this asset management repository, workflow, transcoding, special functions, and so on. And it sits there and it waits to be called. So it could be called by a web page, it could be called by a tablet, mobile, an audio file. I had one client that did things like soundscapes and, to help you sleep and so on. So it could be an audio file, it could be a podcast, voice assistants, the kiosks, all sorts of things. So it waits and it just kind of parks it here. So that's the delivery environment. There's some enhancement with metadata and so on. And then it waits to be called. Now, in a high functioning, robust ecosystem, you have something similar. You've got, your content designers or technical writers, somebody who works with text. It could be a marketing person too, although they tend to have slightly different software, but it's same principle. And then you would have some sort of a content operations suite. So it has component management where you can manage content, not at the document. The document is the final output, but you have all these fiddly bits. You've got the lists and the topics and the little disclaimers that may go here and there and get attached during the orchestration process. And then you've got repository and workflow and quality. So the quality piece is important because you don't have, for images, you don't have spell check and grammar check. And, oh, guess what? You've said this same sentence 12 different ways, and it's going to cost us more if we keep getting these inconsistencies when we go to translate. So we want to have AI-enabled optimization that will catch all of these and then standardize them. And so all of this happens in some sort of a content operations suite. And then you have an orchestration environment. And the orchestration environment is where when you say generate, it resolves all of the markers, all of the variable markers. So it will say, okay, I'm creating a page for the UK and Canada and the USA, and I'm going to figure out what goes into each one, and I'm going to do that orchestration. We will also have some sort of a taxonomy, and then it goes into the CMS. And then the CMS does other things there. So there's analytics, and there's their optimization and load times, and all sorts of things that happen in the content delivery system. And then it sits there and it waits to be called. And it can be called by a number of things as well. So this is the whole idea behind content operations. Oh, I see there's something in the chat. So somebody may have a question. Oh, it's a pleasure to be here. Yes, it's a pleasure to have you here. Okay, so if I look at, and this is a very high level view, obviously, but I wanted to show that to you because it gives you that framework of, you need a production environment, So it's not just a writing environment, but there are more things to production than just writing, and you want to have it all there, particularly with things like reviews, where you have that workflow where you send it out for review and then somebody sees the link and they open it and they can add comments, and then they can either approve or approve with changes or reject it. So it has to go back through again. And that can happen several times depending on what kind of an organization you work with, how precise the content has to be, who has to sign it off, and so on. So all of that goes into production, and then you have orchestration and delivery. So when I look at a couple of examples, here's kind of what happened. In this one, I went through with, they have one writer, 2 days, and he took 58 steps to get the content from the time he got the brief until the time it went into the CMS. There was no system, so there were no steps handled by the system. To update each web page took from start to finish 10 hours. And you might say that's a lot, but it's actually not. When you start to calculate in the collaboration and the finding the new data and inputting the new data and getting the sign-offs and editing this, editing whatever that came back for review, it can add up. So based on 2 days a week, it took him 12 to 18 months to go through all of the pages he had. And that means that if something became inaccurate in month 1, it could stay there for up to 17 months until he got back around to it. So that's quite shocking. And this is a government department, so it's extra shocking because people depend on government information being accurate. And that cost per update cycle cost £30,000. Now, I went in and measured everything he did, and that's how I came to that benchmark. And then I gave him a new process. So those meant that his 58 steps went down to 30 steps. Some of the steps got eliminated completely, but there were 7 steps that were handled by some sort of a, these pieces of the content ecosystem that you saw before. So those 28 steps were reduced to 7, consolidated into 7 steps that were handled by this content authoring system. So the update time went down from 10 hours to 3.5 hours, which meant that the production cycle went from 12 to 18 months to about 4.5 months. And that's still based on, his 2 days a week. And the cost was 10,000 as opposed to 30,000. So that's like 66% decrease in the time and in the cost. And this is quite typical of what you can find when you go in and start working with content. So another client that I had, and I have a, excuse me, I'm publishing in a couple of weeks a white paper on this on my website that tells you more about all the details. There was an online B2B to E product for the UK market. So they had produced it in one language, UK English, for the UK market. So they sold there were subscriptions by large British corporations. They had manual processes. They had psychologists that wrote stuff, threw it over the wall to the technicians, and the technicians were supposed to do all the magic. And their tech was homegrown and not particularly scalable. And they were unable to personalize content. And when you think about, and this was for mental health content. So if you can't personalize your journey, then that becomes quite serious. And they tried with the tools that they knew how. So this came to a head, the burning platform scenario, when they got a contract with a multinational based in the United States. And they said, we have many languages. we're going to start with 4. Show us that you can do 4. We start with French. Second one is Chinese. And I can't remember what the third one was. I think it was Portuguese. And so they had to really step up their game. So they went from being a single market product to a global product. They were able to translate into multiple languages. They made their product, because they could adapt the content so easily, they could make it suitable for multiple markets. And what stuck with me was when they said, we use the wolf as a, something to analyze your dreams. And they went, you can't do that in Brazil. Like, no, it's really taboo. And it's like, oh, okay. So we have to be able to think about all these different markets and what's taboo in their cultures and what's not. So, that was taken into account. The authors could control a lot more of those variants, so they could automate the process more. And then they moved away from this homegrown tech to some industry standard tech. So they followed, when I say industry standards, so they followed standards that made their software interoperable with a lot of other tech. And then they could also personalize their mental health journeys, which meant that their product was, like that jump of the client satisfaction and the not just the client, that like the paying client, but the employees. So the employees said that they were much more confident in the product, which made their bosses more confident, and so on. So what I suggest to everyone is that they look at, these, go back to lean, but not lean manufacturing, lean for services. And there was a book that's quite old now, but it's still, quite good. It was by Mary Poppendieck. And they talk about the 8 wastes of lean. So they're not geared towards manufacturing. They're more geared to digital production. So, unclear communication and duplication of entering or copying data, unnecessary movement of data and files, et cetera, et cetera. And then look at the considerations in your processes. Like, how many processes do you have? You'd be shocked, I bet, if you went to a team of 8 people and asked what their process is, because there are probably 8 different processes. And it's not standardized the way accounting is standardized, because there's no software to kind of keep things in check. How many steps, how many touch points are involved? Do you have that single source of truth? How much automation do you have going, and how much could you have going? If you have process improvement initiatives, who's actually driving that? Because I can guarantee you, if the word GitHub is involved, it's from technicians who are trying to treat content as code. How many of those lean wastes can you eliminate? Does anyone internally even recognize that there's content potential here? And if not, why not? Because that means somebody's asleep at the wheel. And then who understands enough about content operations to be effective? And I think that's really your key content, because it's kind of like a doctor who's diagnosing. You can have 2 people who walk in and say, wow, my neck is really sore. And they can both think that what they want is one of those collars, but maybe one needs antibiotics and the other needs a collar. And I had this situation in one of my first, like 20-some years ago, when I was consulting, where this helicopter company came to me and said, we're trying to update these thousands of pages of documentation. I can't remember if it was 5,000 or 8,000 pages. And we're trying to use master document. And our problem is we need to know how to use master document better. It was like, forget master document, forget word processing. You need this authoring system that lets you do these things and then output to your 29 different countries and 29 different variants of content. And they were so thrilled that there was a solution out there, but they could never have come up with that solution on their own, because they didn't know what was out there. What they knew was Microsoft Word. So they all were looking at Microsoft Word. And it's that kind of thing. If you don't know that air travel exists, and I ask you, how are you going to go from the UK to Ireland? your answer is going to be on a boat, because you know about boats and you know that boats exist, but you don't know that airplanes exist. And so we get a lot of that in the content industry. So I've got a few key takeaways. I know we're coming up to time here, so we're just on time. So your content has a lot of potential as a business asset if you manage it well. And by fixing content production, you would be amazed at how it fixes a lot of these adjacent functions. And I've seen a case where a company didn't want to fix its content processes, and part of the reasons were, my developers will be bored having to pull all this stuff out of the code where it's baked in. And then came COVID, and their product teams, their development teams were working 70-hour days for weeks, and then they were patting themselves on the back because after a month of working 70-hour weeks, they got everything fixed. And if they had done their content well, they wouldn't have had to work any overtime, and they would have been able to, change those things around probably in a week or two. And when you think about content, don't confine yourself to thinking about marketing content. If you look at content operations on, do a Google search, you'll get the first couple of pages about marketing, because that's who has budget. And so every vendor is kind of pandering to marketing, but marketing tends to be 20% of any product. And the other 80% of content is all product related. So we used to call it after sales content, but it's not really after sales anymore. It's the product itself. It's the in-app content. It's the UX writing. It's the technical specs. It's the customer support information. It's all of that needs to be thought of as well. And so this is a hidden cost that can have really serious knock-on effects. And so as you saw, with the example that I gave, I mean, that's just one small example. There are other larger examples that we could talk about another time when it's not being recorded. And so fixing your content production will also take stress off of your other teams. And this lack of awareness is the most common factor when it comes to stasis. It's really quite shocking when you talk to people and they just have no idea what you're talking about. It's almost like they didn't realize that their company had content. So those are my key takeaways. And if you have questions, I can stop sharing and we can have a chat. Who wants to go first? No one has questions? I'm shocked. Okay, who's overwhelmed? Sometimes that happens. Nobody's going to admit to being overwhelmed. Well, if no one else has questions, then I think we'll just we'll wrap it up. Thank you for attending.
Okay. Thank you. I'm not sure if my voice is going through.
Yes, it is.
Okay. Oh yeah, I was saying earlier, and I don't know if it got through, but it was not overwhelming as such, but it was, I suppose you can call it overwhelming because there was a lot to take through. So yeah, it was a bit overwhelming in a certain way. So I'm just trying to process this more than like having questions at this point.
Okay, well, happy processing. If you have any questions later on, you know where to find me on the Fractional Slack channel. And there's some more information on my website, Content Seriously. And, I'm trying to update my website a little bit more frequently so that you have a richer set of resources to draw from.
Right. Yeah. And I know this was recorded, so I'm hoping, because I think I'll need to go back and forth on the recording to really process this.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good one. Bye.